invitation. It's great to be here in Montreal, and what a surprise to come from Texas and all of a sudden be in Montreal. Mindfulness, as noted, has been very central in the discussion between Western modernity, science, and Buddhism, and I'm very glad for Jeffrey's closing remark that we might not wish to take mindfulness as the final statement on what we want to discuss when it comes to Buddhism and modernity. And indeed, it is not the final statement. There's a lot of wonderful work going on right now at Emory and at Stanford, particularly that I'm aware of, where compassion is also significantly in that conversation. Mindfulness is indeed a foundational practice in virtually all schools of Buddhism, I think it's fair to say, but it is not the only practice in any of the schools of Buddhism, even though it has a significant connection with most every type of practice. So what I'm interested in exploring today is how mindfulness, in fact, might be the kind of invitation that Jeffrey suggests, where it touches into some other kinds of conversations, particularly conversations around the senses, because meditation, Buddhist practice, is really a full-bodied experience. It is also a cognitive experience, and there's a lot of interesting neuroscientific work going on today about the interrelationship between the cognitive or cortical, as sometimes said, and the somatic. And the somatic and the cognitive are definitely two ways of investigating what we are as human beings, what the sense of self that we have is. And this, of course, is front and center in both psychoanalysis, psychology, and Buddhist philosophy, as well as practice. What is the nature of the self? What ideas do we have about it? How do we get those ideas? And where might we yet have something to learn? So one of the places where Buddhist meditation practice, mindfulness, and also other practices comes into contact with contemplative scientific discussion. There's a lot of discussion in Mind and Life nowadays in contemplative neuroscience quarters about interoceptivity, which basically means sensing the body within. Now, mindfulness is one very important instrument for sensing the body within. And we have a lot of things that we might sense. We might sense the rhythm of the heart. We might sense the sense of flow through the organs. We might sense thoughts rising and ceasing and so on. Very commonly, of course, attention is placed on the breath. But in another common practice, particularly taught by Goenka, who's been mentioned already, the body scan, taking the mind through the body and beginning to sense, after a while, the, in fact, illusoriness of the solidity of the body. We tend to feel that we are real and solid, but somatic as well as cognitive investigation, deep exploration, begins to reveal that this is not the case. And it can reveal it quite dramatically. In a famous line from the Visuddhimagga, also referred to earlier, the path of purification, Buddhaghosa's really encyclopedic manual for meditation, famous around the fear and terror section that Bob Scharf mentioned earlier. Just as a man with eyes standing on the bank of a pond or on the bank of a river during heavy rain would see large bubbles appearing on the surface of the water and breaking up as soon as they appeared, so too he sees formations break up all the time. So this is potentially a very impactful event in meditation, and it really is not that uncommon to somatically observe the body, perhaps very much grounded in Buddhist philosophy also, because the cognitive and the somatic go together in Buddhism as well. And one would have likely, if one did not do this sort of reflection in the modern era, but in fact was somewhat schooled in Buddhist philosophy, of course we know that impermanence is very important, and one could have a somatic sense of it, which would reinforce the cognitive sense of it, and the cognitive sense of understanding also supports the somatic, so it could be quite impactful. This would be an understanding gained in part through the sense of touch, kinesthetic sense of touch, through a kind of what some would call interoceptivity. So it is an exploration that is operating at the sensory level as well, I would say, as the cognitive or cortical level. And I suspect that a lot of the power of Buddhist practice, not just mindfulness, is the way in which sometimes the somatic, maybe even we could say the energetic or the felt sense of the body reinforces what one has captured cognitively, and vice versa. And there is a certain pleasure in observing this. The kind of, meditation can be, and certainly sounds very boring, keeping the mind on the breath, and nonetheless there is a pleasure that can come with it, and this is something known also to West, Spinoza. It's a very fine quote from Diana Foch's book, a very significant book, which I'll quote in a moment. When the mind regards itself and its own power of activity, it feels pleasure, and that pleasure is greater in proportion to the distinctness wherewith it conceives itself and its own power of activity. There are two themes converging here for me in this statement that are also present in Buddhist thought. One is that the precision with which one observes can be itself a kind of pleasure. This is also the pleasure of intellectual activity, getting really, really into the details. There's a particular pleasure that comes when there is a precise type of observation trained on one's own experience and on one's own understanding. There is also, and I'll come to this later again, there is also a certain kind of sense of agency that arises when I look at my experience. Oh, my body seems solid, but let me look more deeply. Let me really develop a capacity for attention that allows me to sense in a more subtle way what the experience of my body is. And then that sense of solidity may begin to melt, even if only temporarily. But this is a case of engaging in something which and some scientists refer to as efference. So I am doing something, and as a result of that doing, some kind of experience is coming back to me, reafference. So this is a affirming of agency. This type of experience is affirming of agency. If you bite into a lemon and you taste something sour, and if you make the connection, because I bit into the lemon, I taste something sour. That's the efferent, reafferent sort of modality. Well, you've done something that has shaped your experience, and there is a sense of agency coming out of that. Now, a sense of agency is partly constitutive of a sense of self. Whether or not and the extent to which these two can be separated, I think, is a very interesting question, because I would suggest that even in states wherein the reified sense of self and body and so on becomes, let's say, at least somewhat dissolved, don't think that sense of agency goes away. As the narratives of Buddha's life tell it, Buddha never lost a sense of agency. And I believe that it is part of this efference, reafference modality of developing a sense of agency. That is to say, if you put your attention on your breath, well, eventually it'll stay there a little longer than it used to as a result of your intentionality and your you could say efferent activity, you're doing something. So there's a sense of not only do you feel maybe that, oh, now my attention span is getting a little bit longer, but there's also a sense that I'm an agent in creating this process in which my own sense of self is coming under investigation and perhaps changing. Now, in the context of course, doing this, any kind of meditation or doing anything, one is using the mind. And here we come to a cross-cultural point, you might say. We know that in general, for Buddhists and for modern Buddhists, the practice of mindfulness is very much moored in the body. But if we're going to be cross-culturally sensitive, we of course have to recognize that body is not the same thing the world around. And a body in an Asian context, I think throughout Asia, but I'll speak specifically of Buddhism, is the mind, which is in the body, or which is somehow aware of the body, is linked to the body, you might say, by the steed of wind that it rides. Prāna, chi, lung. This is a very important aspect of how embodiment is understood in Tibetan medicine, in Buddhism generally. The body is considered, one narrative of the body is that it is composed of 5 elements, and one of those elements is wind, or currents of energy, or dynamism, we could call it. And this is something that, while not exactly analogous to rigorous Western categories, is, I will want to say in a moment, not so foreign either. And certainly, if we're going to speak about mindfulness, and mindfulness of the body, then, and we're going to be cross-cultural, then we have to recognize that very different things can be meant by the body. And so that will invite us to think about how different paradigms might begin to, how do we deal with different paradigms? This is an important part of our business as cross-culturalists. So in the Buddhist, in a classical Buddhist, particularly perhaps Tibetan, a way of understanding this, mind and its steed of wind are one entity, yet thought and language identify them as separate. This is typical of how thought works. It isolates different aspects of what may be otherwise, at least for direct perception, considered a single type of entity. If we talk about this prāna, or dynamism, as an important element of bodies as understood in Asian culture, and should there be a sense, oh, that's weird, that's nothing like a Western science, we can't measure that, we can't talk about it, and this sort of awkwardness might emerge, I just want to say that really, if we talk about motility, dynamism, currents, it is something that we know quite a bit about already in the West. From the perspective of the definition of the wind or prana, it's that which is light and moving. It's classical definition. And that means that anything associated with movement is actually somehow related with or an expression of this prana. So we know about that. Heart rhythms, the flow of blood, the palpitation of the lungs, as well as more subtle energies flowing through the body, which also become important in some meditative traditions. If you wave your arm, if you stamp your foot, when you speak, Jigme Lingpa says the essence of speech is wind. It doesn't just mean being full of hot air in the way of that sometimes happens when one speaks, but rather that it has essentially a dynamic or energetic quality. So when we talk about mindfulness, and we talk about mindfulness of the body, or mindfulness of breath, or even mindfulness of speech, or even just mindfulness itself, every consciousness rides a steed of wind, so there is always some type of current, dynamism, energy associated with anything that one is contemplating in or out of meditation. And this dynamism is something that is palpable in the body. It is a kinesthetically available event. And it's very common that people will say, you know, after you sit down, meditate even for 10 minutes, and there's a sense of settling, we might say. Well, what is settling? Well, from this perspective, if you understand that the body is filled with these currents, well, these energies are somewhat settling down. And here also, so that, again, if I sit for a while and I begin to feel somewhat different, in whatever way I feel different, I might actually get more anxious. That also is a little advertised aspect that also might occur. But in any case, again, if I make a connection between what I have done, contemplatively speaking, then, as I mentioned before, just like biting into an orange, if I realize that what I have consciously engaged in is producing an effect, then, again, there is a sense of agency. And that agency, again, I would submit, is going to be present in some way, however subtly, even when a more robust and, from a Buddhist perspective, illusory sense of self begins to dissolve. So the kind of trick is going to be in pulling mindfulness along the trajectory toward wisdom, to which it is oriented in the Buddhist tradition, that there will need to be some kind of a more modest ontological sense of self, less reified, and so on, while there could still, but still retaining some kind of sense of agency. Or a more traditional Buddhist way of saying this is that one would not fall to nihilism. One would not decide that one doesn't exist at all and nothing matters. In all of this, in the cultivation of attention to the body, to one's experience, being a good phenomenologist, the sense of touch is quite significant. It's central to interoceptivity in general. It's really, as it turns out, quite central to our sense of who we are in the most ordinary sense. So I want to take a moment to say something about touch, and then I'm going to pass on to some of the other senses. It turns out that in both Western and Buddhist ways of looking at things, a sense of touch is really quite fundamental. A couple quotes here from traditional sources. The body sense power pervades the entire body. If it stops, then all the other senses stop. So here we have, we might say, the eye sense. But the eye sense also has its own tactile capacity. If you touch your eye, you can feel it. So that means there's a kinesthetic sensibility or a sense of touch that pervades the eye, also the ear, and all of the other senses. Moreover, in both Western science and Buddhism, the sense of touch is considered very, very fundamental. It's considered the first sense to develop. And also, if you look at Buddhist descriptions of the stages of death and the process of the dissolving of sensory capacity, the last to go is the sense of touch. So it's very significant. This article by Ackerman that I'm referring to here is very interesting. He points out there that in a series of 6 different experiments, it was discovered that the sense of touch is actually very ingredient in how one performs an activity that has supposedly nothing related with the sense of touch. For example, if you're holding a heavy clipboard and while you interview somebody, it turns out you will feel that your information and your opinion is more important than those people or you yourself if you are holding a light clipboard. If you are somehow holding or dressed in or seated on something that's very coarse in fabric, you will have the impression that your conversation with the other person is not going so well, that it's rough. If you are somehow in contact with something that is very rigid, like you're given, again, a hard clipboard, or I forget the exact object that they used in this part of the experiment, but something that's very rigid, you will have a sense of less flexibility in negotiation. In other words, there's a claim being made here that the somatic, here related with the sense of touch, is very much related to higher cognitive learning. And this mirrors what Diana Fosha says in her book about the relationship between what she calls somatic and cortical learning. And I think that when we look at meditation, it's very interesting to look at it as a process of learning, really, and a confluence of the somatic and the cortical. And I'm going to skip this one, except just to say that in classic presentations of the development of calm abiding, the calm state, in which mindfulness is an ingredient, but it's not the be-all and end-all, far from it. There is a description of how the currents of energy in the body shift in such a way. The winds or currents of energy associated with unsalutary states are calmed and leave the body through the top of the head. And this gives rise to a certain kinesthetic, interoceptive sensation, which then makes possible the actual attainment of calm abiding. Now, in Buddhist practice, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, mindfulness is engaged in other sensory types of experience. So just very quickly, and maybe this is already familiar to many of you, so there is a practice in Goenka's meditation. One takes the mind through the body and eventually begins to feel really something like bubbles or something very granular and fine rather than the coarse body that one ordinarily experiences. In Tibetan meditation, there are many variations of a practice in which one takes light through the body. In fact, one's body may even light up as green Tara if one conflates that with another series of meditative steps. The point is that here again, one is doing something that is both cognitive and somatic. Taking light through the body will affect the felt sense of the body in a way that makes, and really the felt sense of one's own capacity as an agent, in a way that maybe makes quite a bit of sense if we think back to the clipboard example. If you're holding something heavy, it makes you feel more important in a certain kind of egocentric way. If light is flowing through your body, maybe important isn't the axis along which to gauge what the different is, but there's a different sensation, a sense perhaps maybe of more possibility in life, not being so constricted. And this is the sort of thing that it seems to me would be very interesting to begin to analyze with the same sort of scrutiny that meditations on mindfulness have received up until this point. Another thing that's important about attention is that all parts of the body are not created equal as far as being objects of attention goes, as far as at least particularly in the Tibetan tradition. Longchen Rabjam, great figure of the 14th century, points to how at what's called the channel center, which is actually a little bit below the navel, this is considered a very important place in the body by many traditions. In the Tibetan, we call it Zasun Dube Do. It's perhaps better known as the Dantian, also the Kath in Sufic traditions. Many traditions recognize that this is a place in the body where if you place attention, it may have a different kind of impact on your sense of self, on your sensibility, on your sense of being connected with the steadfastness of the earth element, which is said in some traditions to have a particular resonance there, the center of the navel. So this, too, I think, would be of interest to explore. Where you place your mind in the body, what kind of effect might this have emotionally, psychologically, somatically? According to an oral tradition, there are three types of energy in the body. Undirected, as in ordinary life, not really doing anything, we're not manipulating in any way. Directed, as in practices that specifically take the winds or energies through the body in a very particular way, which is just now beginning to be looked at in neurocognitive realms, and that which is beyond both. That's the Buddha. Totally realized, all potential is realized, all obstructions are freed. Again, if we look at a particular understanding of the body, we see that there is rising from the navel, as it were, this very important place in the body where the three channels are said to converge, there is a central channel. And this is a very important place of practice, particularly in the Tibetan traditions. There are many practices which in various ways bring the mind or bring attention or some sense of light or sense of flow through the central channel. And this is kinesthetically quite different from other places in the body. One point I want to make about this is there has been a study recently on the Dumo, the practice of really the fierce woman, but it is a practice most famous for generating core body heat. And it's clear that Tibetan yogis can develop a lot of core body heat through this practice. This is a practice that involves certainly the kinesthetic sense. This practice does involve that second type of pranic endeavor. There is manipulation of the prana. One actually holds the breath in a particular way and also imagines that it is going up one's body, and there are other visual elements to the practice as well. So there are both somatic elements, that is to say the holding of the breath, and also a cortical or cognitive element of, at least as according to Diana Foch's terminology, of seeing something different in the body. And to me, the interesting thing about this particular experiment was that it turned out that the heat was not able to come forth in the same way or for as long just through physical manipulation of the energy of the body. Just through holding the breath alone did not have the same effect as when this was done combined with the visualization that goes along with this practice. Now that's very interesting to me because I have felt for a long time that it would be very wonderful to begin to research how imagining different things in different places in the body might be perhaps even neurologically measurable. How is that going to affect one's personhood, sense of personhood? How might it address certain kinds of issues? So that it seems quite important to note that the cultivation of attention is in many practices profoundly conjoined with not only a kinesthetic sense, but also a visual sense, and also auditory, because often in sending light through one's body, one is also chanting. And this also, of course, has an effect on one's whole experience. And there's much to be looked at yet about this. Now, of course, to conclude, what this is oriented toward, as I mentioned, attention in Buddhist context is always really oriented toward wisdom. And that wisdom in the Mahayana context is always seen as having compassion as its essence. So these things are really not so very separate, even though we are forced to discuss them in separate terms. And I have focused on mindfulness as an orientation toward wisdom, really, is the way I've been talking about it. And what that means is that whether we talk about seeing the body being experienced as a series of moments, one after the other, nama rupa, because, and Goenka often quotes this from the Visuddhimagga, when the body becomes clear, the mind is clear. So to train the mind on the body in a very finely tuned way is going to clarify the mind. And what that is going to do ultimately is going to dissolve a certain type of reified sense of self. All of these practices that I have described will begin to dissolve that. And we could say that psychoanalysis also is looking to dissolve certain kinds of a sense of self, or at least we could say habit patterns, are looking to be weakened, to be opened up so the person has more freedom. And attention, perhaps coupled with some of these other elements, can have a very powerful role to play there in that process of dissolution. In order for a strong habit pattern to give way, one has to have a quality of attention that is as powerful as that habit. That's why just a few hours, even a retreat of seeing your body dissolve into bubbles a few times is not going to do away with a sense of reified self, the sense of what Larry Barcelow calls nouning, the tendency to see oneself and things in general as reified, as nounable, because nouns usually describe reified things, is, it turns out, learned very early in linguistic training. We are more familiar with nouning. There's a very interesting article called The Vice of Nouning. We are very oriented toward nouning, toward solidity. And when that solidity, any kind of solidity, even procrastinating or getting temper tantrums in traffic, if that begins to dissolve, there is some kind of opening there. And that opening is actually what I want to close with. H.J. Almaas, originator of the Diamond Approach, a very well-articulated contemplative and philosophical tradition of modernity, points this out. Even when a self-image does dissolve, as may happen in psychoanalysis, as may happen in conversation with a friend, suddenly, we say, oh, I was so angry, and now I'm not anymore. And isn't that amazing? And so what Almaas is saying, that it's important that that spaciousness that arises in the dissolving of some particular way of holding oneself should be noticed and pointed to. Otherwise, if it's not, it can just be immediately replaced by something else, and you don't get the sense of spaciousness. You don't give it enough attention to enable a person to recognize its significance in relation to the self-image, since the person's model of the possibilities of experience probably does not include the state of inner boundless space. And yet, all the time, as we are releasing certain kinds of self-images, there is a kind of space. And that is perhaps the space to which a mindfulness can most effectively or significantly lead one. And in order for that spaciousness to have an impact, someone needs to point it out. Part of the Buddhist tradition is to point it out.